There's a stretch of woods in New Hampshire where people go to clear their heads. You hike it, you hunt it, you walk right through it thinking nothing of it. And that's the problem, because nothing about this place asks for your attention. No signs, no fences, no reason to think twice before stepping off the trail. The forest looks calm, almost polite. Kind of place that lets you believe nothing bad has ever happened there. But woods like this are good at one thing: waiting. They don't rush, they don't panic, they just let time do the heavy lifting. Whatever was hidden here wasn't buried deep, it wasn't rushed, and it definitely wasn't meant to be found anytime soon. For years, people passed within feet of it, close enough to hear the wind moving through the trees, close enough to smell the damp leaves under their boots, never realizing what was sitting quietly nearby. And when it finally came to light, it didn't raise questions, it wrote timelines. It exposed how patient someone had been. And it proved that some crimes aren't loud, they're deliberate. This is one of those stories where the answers came slowly, and some of them still haven't come at all. This is the story of what was hidden in Bear Brook State Park. So, grab a light and let's step into the dark together. In November of 1985, Bear Brook was quiet in that late fall way. Bare trees, damp leaves, the kind of cold that settles into your lungs and stays there. A hunter stepped off the trail, not far, just enough to check something he noticed in the brush. No reason to be cautious, no reason to think this was anything more than debris. That's when he saw it. A rusted metal barrel laying on its side, half covered by leaves and dirt. Old, weathered, the kind of thing you assume someone dumped years ago, because people dump everything in the woods. Tires, scrap metal, sometimes even their common sense. At first it didn't seem important, but as he got closer, the smell reached him. Not sharp, not immediate, just wrong. It wasn't strong enough to stop him in his tracks, but it didn't belong there. It clung to the cold air, faint but unmistakable. Not the smell of animals, not the rot of wet leaves and soil, something heavier. Something that didn't fade when he stepped away. And as he reached the barrel, that uneasy feeling stopped being a suspicion. When he got there, his fear became real, because what was in that barrel wasn't just trash. Inside were the remains of an adult woman and a young girl. For a moment, there was disbelief, that incentive pause where your brain tries to tell you this can't be what you're seeing, that there has to be another answer, that there has to be another explanation, something easier, something less final. But there wasn't. He didn't stay to investigate, he didn't linger. He got out of those woods as fast as he could and contacted authorities, leaving the barrel exactly where it was, waiting in the same place it had been left for years. Police responded, the area was secured, the barrel was removed, and investigators searched the surrounding woods, expecting, hoping there might be more. But again, there wasn't. And that created a bigger problem than anyone expected. No missing person report matched. No one came forward. No one recognized the descriptions. The woman and the child had no names. Only a location and a container. They were logged as unidentified. Their case quietly folded into the system while Bear Brook State Park went back to being a place people passed through without knowing what it had briefly given up. But from the beginning, something about that felt unfinished, because barrels don't end up in the woods by an accident. From the outside, it looked like a terrible but isolated discovery. One barrel, 2 victims, a remote stretch of the woods, tragic but contained. That's how it was supposed to make sense. Investigators worked the scene, collected evidence, and began doing what they always do next, trying to rebuild lives from what little was left behind. They searched for missing person reports, they compared timelines, they looked for anyone who might recognize the woman or the child. And they came up empty. No one was reporting them missing, no records lined up. There was no clear window for when the barrel had even been placed there. Even the location itself raised questions. This wasn't a place you stumbled into by an accident. Whoever left that barrel knew the area well enough to step off the trail without being seen, and was confident enough no one would be back there anytime soon. And then there was the barrel. Not a bag, not a shallow grave, just a container. Something that had been brought in on purpose, filled, sealed, and left behind. It wasn't quick. It wasn't panicked. It suggested time, control, and patience. That's when the questions stopped sounding routine. Why go through the effort of hiding bodies like this? Why here? And why did it feel like the woods were holding on to more than they were letting go? The case slowed, leads dried up, files were boxed on shelves. On paper, it became another cold case. Tragic, unresolved, but officially quiet. Unofficially, it wasn't. Because no matter how many times investigators walked away from it, the same thought kept circling back. People don't leave barrels in the woods unless they're trying to make something disappear. And people who go through that kind of effort rarely stop at just one. Time moved on the way it always does. Slowly for the case, quickly for everyone else. Seasons rolled through Bear Brook State Park without pause. Snow covered the trails. Leaves fell again. Hikers, hunters, and families passed through the same woods, never knowing how close they were to a story that had simply stopped. On paper, the investigation was still open. In reality, it was stuck. Without names, there was no past to trace. Without a timeline, there was no moment to anchor to. And with no witnesses, there was nothing to chase. No loose threads to pull. The woman and the child remained unidentified. No funerals, no gravestones, no one standing at the podium demanding answers. The case files were revisited, then set aside. New investigators inherited the same notes, read the same reports, and reached the same dead ends. Every so often, someone would look at it again and feel the same unease settle in, because something about it never fit. The barrel didn't feel impulsive, the location didn't feel random, and the total absence of missing people reports didn't feel accidental. It felt less like a mistake and more like a decision, as whoever was responsible had planned for exactly this outcome. Planned for time to pass, planned for questions to fade, planned for the woods to do the rest. Years turned into more years. The case slipped out of headlines, then out of memory. Officially, it became another cold case. Unofficially, it lingered, because one thought refused to go away. People don't go through this much trouble unless they're hiding something, and they don't usually stop at just one. That question would eventually land on the desk of one investigator, someone who wasn't willing to believe the story ended with a single barrel. Nearly 15 years passed after the first barrel was found. 15 years of seasons coming and going. 15 years of people walking the same trails. 15 years of a case slowly collecting dust while the woods stayed exactly where they were. After nearly 15 years of silence, the case found its way to an investigator named Cody. Which is kind of funny because we share the same name. But here's the thing, Cody hadn't even been on the force when the first barrel was discovered. He came onto the case without the weight of the old assumptions. No attachment to the original conclusions. No pressure to treat it like something already solved. On paper, the story looked complete. A discovery, an investigation, a dead end, tragic, unresolved, but quiet. Cody didn't see it that way. What bothered him was the time. Not just how long it had been since the barrel had been found, but how long it had been sitting there before anyone could have noticed. The placement wasn't careless. It wasn't rushed. It felt like something meant to outlast attention. And then there was a bigger question. If someone was patient enough to hide a barrel in the woods and wait years for it to be discovered, why assume they only did it once? Instead of staying behind a desk, Cody went back to Bear Brook, back to the original site, back to the trees that had quietly watched the first discovery, and then kept their mouth shut for over a decade. He didn't walk the trails like a visitor. He stepped off of them. He looked at the area the way the person who placed the barrel would have looked at it, thinking in terms of distance and cover, thinking about where you'd go if you had the time and confidence, and no intention of coming back. That's when it clicked. If someone had been willing to wait 15 years for one barrel to be found, there was more room, more time, more opportunity. So, Cody expanded the search area, and that's when he saw it. Another rusted metal barrel, buried deeper this time, older, heavier, hidden in a way that suggested learning, adjustment, experience. When it was opened, the truth landed hard. Inside were the remains of 2 more children. The case hadn't gone cold. It had been waiting. What was believed to be a single isolated discovery was now something else entirely. Something deliberate, repeated, and stretched across years. Bear Brook hadn't been holding one secret. It had been holding 2, 15 years apart. The discovery of the second barrel changed everything. What had once been treated as an isolated crime was now impossible to explain away. 4 victims, 2 barrels, placed years apart, hidden with care. Whatever this was, it wasn't random, and it wasn't finished by accident. Investigators shifted gears. This was no longer just about identifying victims. It was about finding someone who had lived quietly enough, long enough, to let time do the work for them. But there still was a problem. There was no name, no eyewitnesses, no clear timelines, no known connection between the victims. And back when the first barrel was found in 1985, there was a reason for that. DNA testing, as we know it today, simply didn't exist. There was no genetic genealogy, no massive database to search, no way to connect remains to distant relatives who didn't even know they were part of the same family tree. Investigators were limited to what they could see, what they could match, and who came forward. And in this case, no one did. Whoever did this hadn't just hidden the bodies. They'd made sure there was nothing left to trace back to them. For years, the science just wasn't there, but now it was. And then, something unexpected surfaced. DNA testing revealed that 2 of the victims, the children found in the barrels, were biologically related. Sisters, not just connected by circumstances, but by blood. So that changed the shape of the case. If the children were related, then the woman found with them likely wasn't random either. She wasn't a stranger caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was part of the same story. But that story still didn't have a beginning. It wasn't until investigators widened their search beyond New Hampshire, beyond Bear Brook entirely, that pieces finally started to line up. Records from other states, old arrests, men who moved often, men who changed names. That's when one name surfaced. Terry Rasmussen. And honestly, I don't even know if I'm saying his name right, and considering the piece of shit he was, I don't really care. Because Terry Rasmussen wasn't even the name he used most often. Depending on where he was and who he was trying to be, he also went by names like Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, and Gordon Jensen, and probably more we'll never know. And I mean, if you're just out here picking your own names, don't you think you'd come up with something better? But then again, that, I guess, is kind of the point. These weren't names meant to stand out. They weren't meant to be remembered. They were meant to blend in, pass through, and disappear, just like the lives he left behind. Not a household name, not someone people recognized on sight, just a man who drifted from place to place, leaving fragments of his life behind. Aliases, abandoned relationships, unanswered questions. At first, the connection was thin, circumstantial, easy to dismiss, until it wasn't. Because more investigators pulled on that thread, the more it tightened around one uncomfortable truth. Rasmussen wasn't just connected to Bear Brook. Bear Brook was only one stop. The man they were starting to uncover hadn't lived one life. He lived many, and each one ended quietly, without explanation. The barrels weren't an ending, they were a chapter. Once investigators had a name, real or not, they finally had something to work backward from. And when they did, the picture that formed wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, ordinary, and somehow worse because of it. Terry had spent decades drifting from place to place, moving through communities without ever settling into one. He worked odd jobs, he entered relationships, he played the part of a normal guy just well enough to avoid attention. And then he'd disappear under a new name, in a new town, with a slightly rewritten version of himself. As investigators dug into those past lives, they started finding gaps. Women who vanished, children who were never seen again, relationships that ended without explanation, and one case in particular stood out. In California, Rasmussen was arrested for the murder of a woman named Evelyn Honeychurch, a crime completely unrelated to Bear Brook, but chilling in its own right. He was convicted, he went to prison, and even then, he didn't tell the truth. He never fully explained who he was, he never accounted for where he'd been, and he never spoke about the children connected to him. Rasmussen died in custody in 2010, taking answers with him, which meant investigators were left doing what they've been doing all along, working around silence, using records, using timelines, using DNA, and slowly, painfully, they began to identify some of the victims connected to him. Not because he told them who they were, but because science finally could. Families who had no idea they were connected to this case were suddenly pulled into it decades later. Names were restored, histories were rebuilt, and pieces of the story that Rasmussen had tried to erase began resurfacing anyway. But even with those breakthroughs, the story wasn't finished, because one victim, the adult woman found in the first barrel, still had no name. No identity, no confirmed past. No clear connection to Rasmussen beyond proximity and circumstance. She remains unknown. which means Rasmussen's reach, how many lives he touched, how many he ended, may never be fully understood. What investigators do know is this: he didn't act once, he didn't act impulsively, and he didn't stop because he was caught. He stopped because time ran out. When the noise fades, what's left isn't the barrels, it isn't the aliases, and it isn't even the man responsible. What's left are the people who were almost erased. Through decades of work and evidence in DNA science, investigators were finally able to identify the 3 children found in the barrels. Names were restored, families were found, lives that had been reduced to evidence numbers were given their identities back. That mattered. But this story still doesn't end cleanly, because the adult woman found in the first barrel remains unidentified. For decades, she has existed in reports and files as a Jane Doe, defined not by who she was, but by where she was found. No confirmed family, no known history, just fragments. Enough to know she existed, but not enough to tell us who she was before she ended up hidden in the woods. And that absence matters, because she wasn't just the woman in the barrel. She was someone long before Bear Brook. Someone with a life, relationships, and a story that hasn't been recovered yet. Terry died without ever telling investigators who she was. He took that knowledge with him, which means even after all the breakthroughs, all the silence, and all the time that's passed, this case still carries one unanswered question at its center. Not because no one cared, but because some crimes are designed to leave nothing behind. Bear Brook reminds us of that justice doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes in fragments. Sometimes it comes decades late. And sometimes it's still waiting for a name. The forest didn't forget, just hasn't finished speaking. Cases like this don't end cleanly. There's no dramatic confession, no final explanation that ties everything up with a bow. Just pieces, some found, some still missing. And the uncomfortable reminder that some people spend their entire lives trying not to be remembered. And sometimes, they almost succeed. If you've made it this far, you're probably the kind of person who likes sitting with stories like these. The ones that don't let go right away. And I cover these cases all the time, so if that's your thing, you know where to find me. If there's a case that you want me to dig into next, something unsolved, unsettling, or just deeply strange, drop it in the comments. I actually pull ideas from there more than you'd think. And if this one stuck with you, a like helps more than you realize. It keeps these stories moving and makes sure they reach the people who are looking for the same kind of content. Thanks for stepping into this one with me. And as always, stay curious, stay brave, and stay spooky.